Hello and welcome back. So I hope you completed your hands-on exercise using the real life integration scenario, right? And let's go ahead and enhance this interface. So assuming you already built the interface, now you're receiving a change request. They are asking you to change something in the interface. Let's go ahead and understand the requirement. What's the current requirement for this change, right? So the requirement has changed, and instead of the CRM API, now you have to update the marketing preferences directly into the CRM database table, right? So now there is no API from CRM. Maybe API wasn't functioning as efficient as it should, and maybe the CRM architect decided that rather than using their API, we can use connection directly to their database, and we can simply update their database directly using the logic app, right? So this also allows less time, and it's more control. Rather than adding another API hop, we can now directly insert this data into the CRM database. Now we have been given the database name, it's called CRM DB, and the table name is called marketing preference, right? So you've been given the table name and the database name, and they've also given you the format of this database. So in this database, we can see there's a client ID, and then there's something called is consent, right? And there's something called marketing preferences. So you have these three main columns in the database, and then there are two additional columns, which is updated by and date updated, right? So usually whenever you're updating any table, there are some auditing parameters, right? So whenever somebody wants to look at this data, they should also know that who has created or updated this data. So this table also has those two additional auditing parameters. Let's see how we are going to change the design, right? So we have the customer using this form on the e-commerce portal. The e-commerce portal would write this JSON to the service bus queue. We already have the logic app. We've created the logic app, right, to read the message from the queue. And then we want to do the transformation, but instead of the JSON transformation, now we have to transform this into the data that can be sent to the database. Now, how can we do this, right? There are few ways to do this. You can directly insert this into the table using the SQL connections, or there is more efficient way. You can create a stored procedure. Now, I'm assuming you are familiar with the SQL, right? Or any other database pretty much works the same way. So you can directly insert into the table columns, or you can use a store procedure to do more controlled insert operation, right? Because we don't want to simply insert, we also want to update. So if the customer had previously selected some preferences, right, we want to update that preference. And if the customer is doing this for the first time, we want to insert that preferences into the CRM database. Now we've been given the database details, we've been given access to that database and to that table. So let's go ahead and get started. First thing we are going to do is connect to that database and check out the table, right? So I already have created a sample database on Azure, and I strongly suggest you do the same. It's very straightforward. Let me quickly give you an overview. So you go to the Azure portal and then search for Azure SQL. Now, if you have an existing SQL database, you can obviously use that. But if you don't have, and if you still want to practice this, I suggest you use this Azure SQL and create a sample database there, right? And then on this Azure SQL, you can start by adding new database, and you can select any of these options. Just go through all of these options. I suggest to start with, or to test the database, right? Use the last option, which is the SQL virtual machines, and select the free SQL server license and go ahead and create. So it would create a virtual machine, and it would also install the developer version, which doesn't cost you any licensing fee for the SQL, right? And it would take few minutes, and it would take you to the wizard, through the wizard, and you would create the sample SQL database, right? So create this sample database to test and to work with this hands-on exercise. I've already created a SQL database called CRMDB. This is what is created by the CRM people for us, right? They have the existing database and you have the access to this database. Now you need to look at the table. Let's go ahead and see the table. Let's refresh this table and we can see there is a table called TBL MKTG preference. So this is the table name, right? Let's go ahead and see if there is any data, right? Let's click on new query and select star from table marketing preference and let's execute. There is no data at the moment, right? Now to insert data into this table, we want to create a stored procedure, right? So let's go to the programmability options in this database and then stored procedure. And let's create a new stored procedure, right? This is the easiest way to get started, to create any new stored procedure, right? Let's give it a name. I'm going to give a name of USP upsell marketing preferences. Okay, this is the name I'm going to use. Now the second part is creating parameters. Now we know we have to pass in 3 parameters. Those are the 3 business parameters. Let's go ahead and add those parameters. The first one was client ID, which is an int parameter. Second one is consent. Now this is a beat parameter, right? Beat is 1 or 0. It's similar to true and false, right? You can pass true and false, but it will automatically convert that into a beat as 0 and 1. And the last parameter is preferences. This is an varchar max. Okay, so we need to pass in these 3 parameters to the stored procedure. Now coming to the actual actions inside this stored procedure, right? This is where we start writing the actual statement. So we first want to see if this client has any existing preferences or not, right? So let's go ahead and see how do we do this. So let's go back to the query here and let's search select count star from this table where client ID is equal to the input client ID, right? So we want to check this count. Let's copy this. Let's go back and let's start typing here. Client ID is equal to the client ID parameter. So this would give us the count. If there are any entries in this table for this existing client, right, we want to update that preferences, right, rather than inserting that preferences. So if the count is more than 0, so let's write the condition if this count is more than 0. Okay, so this is our first condition. Let's do begin and end. And if that is not true, then we start another condition and we do begin and end. If it's greater than 0, that means the client exists, right? So we want to update this table. Okay, so here we want to update this client's preferences, right? So we'll use set and preferences. This is the column is equal to @ the input parameter was preferences, right? And then the second update is going to be is consent, and the parameter name is also is consent. Then we have two more auditing parameters, right? Let's go ahead and update them as well. So updated by, we want to every time use the same value. Interface, it's a hard-coded value, right? And then update date updated, we want to pass current existing date and time that this is being updated. So we'll use get date function. This would get the latest date and time, right? So we've just used this update function, but where client ID is equal to the incoming client ID, right? So if the client ID exists, if the count is greater than 0, that we want to update this table. Okay, so this completes the if statement. Now coming to the else statement, we want to insert a new record into the same table, right? So insert into table marketing preference. Now these are the basic SQL syntax, right? So if you're not familiar with this SQL syntax, just Google them through, or if you are familiar with any other database syntax, this would still be very familiar, right? So the insert into statement, the first we use the column names, right? So let's use the actual table column names. Marketing preference is consent, updated by, and date updated. And then we use values, and then we pass the values for the exact same fields, right? So for the client ID, at client ID, this is the incoming parameter that we receive as an input, okay? And then we have at preferences, and then we have at is consent, then updated by, we hard code as interface, and we use the get date function as part of the date updated. Now let's go ahead and execute this. So we just created a stored procedure, right? That would take 3 parameters as inputs. It would first check if the client already exists, and if it exists, then it would update that client. If the client does not exist, then it would insert the new preferences of that client, right? Let's go back to the logic app. Okay, so here we started by sending the data to the API, CRM API. Now here, instead of the API, we now want to send this data to the database. So let's go to the edit mode. Let's click on the logic app name. Let's click on edit, and let's remove this because we don't need this anymore. What we want to do is we want to use Sql Operations. Let's add next step, and let's search for Sql. Okay, we already know the database name, table name, and the stored procedure name, right? So let's go ahead and click on SQL Server. Okay, and then here you can see there are multiple operations, multiple actions that you can take, right? You can delete a row, you can execute a query, you can execute a stored procedure, right? You can do a select, so you get a row. You can do multiple things here, right? Let's select the execute stored procedure action, because that's what we want to do here. Now, when you're connecting to the SQL Server for the first time, it would ask you to create the connection. So let's give it a name of Atlas SQL connection, and authentication type is SQL Server authentication. Now, this is, it depends on what type of authentication you have. It's not always SQL Server authentication, right? But in this case, I've created a user account that has a SQL Server authentication on that SQL Server. SQL Server name is Atlas SQL VM. The database name is CRM DB. The username, I already have my own username to connect to this database, which is Atlas integration, and the password, let me type in my password, and I'm not using any connection gateway. Now we'll come back to the gateway in the later exercises, right? But whenever you want to connect from your logic app, which is in your Azure cloud, to a SQL server which is on premises, which is not on the cloud, right? That's when you want to use the gateway. We'll learn about that in future. Let's go ahead and create. Okay, so we've just created the connection to the SQL server. So let's go ahead and select the SQL server name. And let's go ahead and select the database, which is CRMDB. And now it would also show us the list of stored procedure that's available. So the one that we created, it should be available here. So let's go ahead and select. There we go. USP Upsert Marketing Pref. So as soon as we select this stored procedure, it would also allow us to choose the input parameters. Let's go ahead and select that. And there we go. So we have 3 potential input parameters. So let's select all of them. And let's pass the values from the JSON from the previous shape where we parsed the JSON into an actual JSON object, right? So client ID is going to be customer ID, is consent is going to be, let's select the dynamic field here. Is consent is going to be contact by email, and preferences are preferences. There we go. Let's go ahead and save. So this execute stored procedure action is going to connect to the database, will execute this stored procedure, and will pass these 3 parameters to that stored procedure. And we just created the stored procedure. We know that if the client ID exists, then it will update the preferences. If the client ID does not exist, then it would create the preferences row in that database, right? So now let's go ahead and test this, right? To test this, we just need to simply drop the message in the queue. So we have the sample message here. Let's hit start so that the message is created in the queue. There we go. And then let's go to the history of this logic app so we can see if it was executed. There we go. So we can see that it was successfully executed. And here is the stored procedure. And the response says 200. That means it has successfully inserted these 3 fields into the database. So let's go ahead and open that database again. And now run the select query. So it should return us 1 record as we've just added that record. There we go. Right? And the date and time is also updated to the current date and time. It's updated by the interface, which was the static value we selected. Let's add another record. Let me change the client ID to 111. Contact by email is true, and let's leave the rest of the thing as is. Start. There we go. And let's see if the logic app has been executed. There we go. You can see that it just completed execution, and if we refresh here, we should see another record with the client ID ending with 111. There we go. And is consent is, if you can see, it automatically translated the true into 1 as a bit, right? Let's try and update the same one so we can also test the update scenario, right? So what we would do is we would remove this outdoor garden option and we'll just leave kitchen and bathroom. So this is assuming that the client has updated their preferences, that they're not interested into anything else but just kitchen and bathroom. Let's go ahead and send this. And if this works well, then we should have this second record updated, and the marketing preferences should only have kitchen and bathroom, not the outdoor and garden. Let's run this, and there we go. So the stored procedure is functioning as expected, and now we have the interface enhanced. We have just updated the interface to insert data directly into the CRM database instead of sending it to their API, right? Now this could be, based on every organization's preference, every system's preference. But just to simulate a change request, we first created and sent the request to the API, and then second, we created the request and sent it to the database using this stored procedure. I hope you're following this and do this hands-on along with me. If you have any questions, go ahead and ask in the Slack channel, right? When it comes to the SQL Server setup, right, it can get a little bit tricky, but use all the help from Google. There are plenty of tutorials on how to set up a SQL Server database on Azure, right? So you can use Azure SQL Server, you can set up individual SQL Server instance. There are plenty of options. But if you just do a quick search of how to set up a SQL Server on Azure, it would give you plenty of options for you to review. If you still struggle setting up SQL, please go ahead and ask in this Slack channel, and somebody would help you out to figure how to do that, right? We've just completed the part 2, the second hands-on exercise, second real-life integration scenario, right? And I'll see you in the next one. Thank you.